Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughn Manor, where it's Wednesday. That means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, I'll talk about a certain comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue over on his channel will talk about the same comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team up that we do once a week. And the comic book I'm going to be talking about today, well, I would be surprised if anyone else has done a video on this comic book, but maybe they have. So, it is Garbogust, which on BookTube is an event created by Criminali that celebrates trashy fiction. Men's adventure, category romance, novelizations, stuff that society thinks is trash. And there's this comic book that Marvel did that seems to have many elements that you would find in some of those trashy kinds of books. It has an anti-hero, a tough guy, men's adventure type of anti-hero. It has kind of a lost world. It has a lost world. It has dinosaurs. It has cavemen. It has all kinds of stuff, all kind of mixed up into one comic book. And that comic book is the immortal Skull the Slayer. Skull the Slayer, which lasted 8 whole issues. It lasted 8 whole issues. And it was terrible. This is a terrible comic book. But the comic book itself, if you just read it as a story, is not terribly interesting. There are interesting things about it, though. So this will not be probably, you never know, but this will not be my longest Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Just because the story itself, the story of Skull the Slayer, is not terribly interesting. Basically, it's about this guy who's he's an ex-soldier who was a POW for years and years in Vietnam. He gets back home. He discovers that his wife has left him for another man. His parents have died. His brother is turned into an insane junkie who tries to murder him for absolutely no reason. And in their struggle, Skull's brother is killed. So what does Skull do? His real name is Scully, but everybody calls him Skull. What does Skull do? He runs. He runs to Bermuda. He runs to Bermuda, where he is captured, ends up on a plane, which goes through some kind of, it goes through the Bermuda Triangle, which we all know will take you to another dimension. And it takes him to another Earth. It takes him to another reality that's full of cavemen and dinosaurs and other things. And along with Skull are some other characters. None of these characters are interesting. I can't remember. I've read all 8 issues, but I don't remember their names. So basically, the characters are the love interest. There's the love interest. There is the guy that hates Skull, and there's the boring kid whose dad was a senator, and Skull. So those are the characters, and they have tedious adventures. And it shouldn't be tedious because there's all kinds of cool stuff going on in this comic, but it is pretty terrible. The artwork, however, is pretty good. And this is the first issue of Skull the Slayer. The first issue's artwork is by Steve Gann. And he's on the comic book for a couple issues. And, a few issues maybe. But he is replaced eventually by Sal Buscema. Sal Buscema replaces him. But it's the writers who change a lot. This has, in 8 issues, we start off with Marv Wolfman, we go to Steve Englehart, and we end up with Bill Mantlo. And nobody can make this comic book work. We have lots of action. We've got Skull fighting dinosaurs. Unfortunately, when he fights dinosaurs, he can't shut up. He has to talk, and some of the writing and the dialogue in this is absolutely horrendous. I mean, it's the Bronze Age at its worst. So this is Skull talking while he's fighting the dinosaur. So he's swinging up on the dinosaur. That's it, baby. Swing higher. He swings up on the dinosaur. Now, carry myself to the neck and hold on for dear life, he says while he's going on top of the dinosaur. Wanna dance, precious? Then again, I've been out of it so long I probably don't know the latest steps. Hey, you don't have that to hold against me, you know. It wasn't my fault, Skull says insanely while he's on top of a dinosaur's head. Okay, you asked for it, honey. I'm through with blind dates from this point on, he says as he stabs the dinosaur in the skull. And then the dinosaur goes off a cliff. And the dialogue, I mean, the captions are no better than the dialogue. It's awful. And when the show is over, the curtain falls and the dinosaur falls off the cliff. Last minute scores coming in now. Prehistoric carnivore 0. Human slump 1. That's 3 men down, none left on base at the bottom of the first. And the whole, so this is terrible. The comic book is terrible. But there are some interesting things about the comic which kind of tells you how things worked in comic books at this point in time. When did this first issue come out? I can't remember, but I know it was the 1970s somewhere, because this is a very, very 1970s comic book. Let's see if it's not written too small for my eyes to see, since I don't have my glasses on. So, yeah, does it even say? 1975 it came out, it looks like. So, this was the brainchild of Marv Wolfman, who is actually a good comic book writer. You would never know it from this, but he's written some really good comic books. Most notably, to my mind, he wrote Tomb of Dracula. Tomb of Dracula was like the great Marv Wolfman comic book. But he wrote everything. I mean, he wrote a ton of stuff for both Marvel and DC Comics. Now, his idea for this was kind of interesting, because originally he had an idea. What would happen if an entire apartment building and all the people in it were suddenly transported back to the Earth in prehistoric times, to Jurassic times. And all of these people, all these regular, everyday people, would have to suddenly try to survive in a world full of dinosaurs. And, what would they do? How would they survive? So that was the original idea, from which grew Skull the Slayer. And that's kind of an interesting idea. What would they do? And how would these ordinary people, because originally they were supposed to be ordinary people, how would they survive? And what kind of adventures would they have? And would they form their own society and whatever? Now that was refused as an idea, because the argument went that would be too many people in a comic book. That's too many characters to juggle. It's not sustainable, this whole idea. It just wouldn't work as a comic book. I think it probably would work, actually. I think it would probably work really well. But it was refused. And so what we ended up with was a handful of people in an airplane that goes through that flies through the Bermuda Triangle, and of course goes to this alternate Earth. It's not just prehistoric times they end up in. It's an alternate Earth where you have cavemen and dinosaurs, living at the same time. And there's a time tower which they end up in, which takes them to different versions of our history, but it's different. Anyway, you have the main character, Skull, who is completely unlikable, and he ends up with super strength because he decides to steal a belt off of the corpse of an alien, a dead alien. He just decides to steal it. And this gives him super strength so that he can actually just fight dinosaurs more realistically unlike that last battle I talked about from the first issue. And because it was the 70s, they decided to make him an anti-hero. You know, we have this whole thing about, you know, he suffered, you know, he's gone through the war. His wife leaves him for this other man, and his brother tries to kill him. You get the idea that nobody liked Skull very much in his life, and he is a very unlikable character. So I am not surprised that I'm not surprised his wife left him. I'm not surprised his brother tried to kill him. Although, I don't believe the story that Marv Wolfman tells. I think that Skull really did murder his brother, because Skull's such a jerk. I mean, he's called Skull the Slayer. You know, if you're a guy who's wanted for murder and on the run, don't call yourself Skull the Slayer. Anyway, first of all, this whole situation is ridiculous. He could have got off. If his brother was really stoned and trying to kill him with a knife and accidentally got killed in self-defense, Skull would have got off. Because they would have done an autopsy. Yeah, this guy was totally stoned. We have no proof one way or the other of what happened. He would have gotten off. Instead, he runs. He does the dumbest thing. And it makes sense because Skull is a knucklehead. He's a complete idiot. He's an idiot through this whole comic book. All 8 issues, he's an idiot. It's a terrible comic book, really. With some really nice art. I mean, we've got some... Sal Buscema did a good job. We had Pablo Marcos showed up on this comic book. But nobody stayed on this comic book. Here's the scene where everybody steals clothing from corpses. Bunch of dead people, hey, let's steal their clothes. So we can have these cool new costumes. You know, they all have to have costumes because it's a comic book. They can't just be wearing regular clothes. No. So, because this comic book was so bad, despite some good artwork, people stopped reading it. And, you know, they went through 3 writers. Nobody could save this mess. And the most terrible fate that can befall a comic book befell this comic book. In that, in the 8th issue, at the end of the 8th issue, if you're one of the 2 fans of Skull the Slayer, you're going to be really pissed because this is the last scene of the 8th issue. It's a cliffhanger. A cliffhanger. And it's canceled. It's the last issue. No issue 9. You'll never find out how this story resolves. Now, at the bottom, it says next. Well, what can we say? This is it, pilgrims. In comic books, they were always saying pilgrims. This is it, pilgrims. They always said that in the 70s for some reason. The very last issue. Unless you care enough to make your voices heard. Write skullduggery. And if you will it, the Slayer will soon be back. Nobody willed it. There was no massive write-in campaign to save Skull the Slayer. Nobody wanted Skull the Slayer to come back. But it was a sad thing to happen. You had this comic book that lasted 8 measly issues and ended on a cliffhanger. What will happen? Fortunately for Skull the Slayer, there was a guy back in the 1970s who, if your comic book was canceled, he would show up and he would let you onto his comic book and he would wrap up your storyline. This was a nice thing to do, very charitable. And the guy who did this was The Thing from the Fantastic Four. The Thing from the Fantastic Four. He starred every month in Marvel 2-in-1. Or was it quarterly? I don't remember. Was it every 6 months? I don't remember. But he was in Marvel 2-in-1. And what The Thing would do, because he's generous, Ben Grimm from the Fantastic Four. He's a generous guy. What The Thing would do is if your comic book was canceled, he would let you onto his comic book for an issue or 2 and wrap up whatever storyline was going on in your comic book before your comic book was canceled. And sure enough, he did that for poor Skull the Slayer. So we have Marvel 2-in-1 number 35, where the Thing just shows up to finish up Skull's story. And actually, we have 2 issues of Marvel 2-in-1 where the Thing shows up to have adventures with Skull. And it actually, the whole storyline wraps up in present day with an issue where the Thing teams up with Mr. Fantastic, which, you know, he does every month anyway in the Fantastic Four. But Mr. Fantastic and the Thing, it takes both of them to wrap up Skull's stupid storyline, which they do. This was a kind service that the Thing offered in the 70s. So it was sort of a tragic tale. You know, we have this comic book with decent artwork, a story not worth telling, with a bunch of stuff that could have been cool but wasn't. Inexplicably bad writing on Marv Wolfman's part. And it was just a forgettable comic book. But despite what I called this video, no Marvel character is ever really forgotten. Every Marvel character, no matter how bad they are, will show up again in the Marvel Universe. And indeed, Skull has shown up from time to time after the cancellation of his terrible comic book. You know, somebody will be like, hey, you remember Skull? Let's bring Skull the Slayer back. Only we'll make his skin transparent so he just looks like a big skeleton. Isn't that a good idea? Yeah, man, that's a good idea. Let's do that. Let's bring back Skull as a transparent skeleton. And so they do. But really, Skull was a dumb character. Literally. I mean, this guy was an idiot. It's hard for me to think of a character dumber than well, maybe the Hulk. Maybe the Hulk was dumber than Skull. Maybe. That's a tough call, Roger. Anyway, I apologize officially to Steve Donoghue for reading this comic. Don't feel obliged to make a video about Skull the Slayer. I feel kind of bad for tormenting Steve Donoghue in this way. Next week, no more Garb August. Officially next week, Wednesday falls in August, but I can't take any more trashy comics. So next week, we're going to talk about something really, really cool. So catch me then, and I will see you next time.